Ella Savoy had orchestrated 37 charity galas without a single disaster. The 38th was supposed to be her masterpiece. Instead, it became the night she kissed the most dangerous man in New York, and didn't know it until it was too late. Ella Savoy had spent 6 months planning the Grand Mirabelle Charity Gala down to the last champagne flute. Her reputation as New York's most sought-after event coordinator depended on tonight's perfection. The crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in liquid gold, and somewhere in this glittering crowd of Manhattan's elite, her boyfriend Adrian was supposed to be securing investors for his gallery expansion, the one they'd dreamed about over Sunday morning coffee and 5-year plans. Instead, she found him with his mouth on a blonde investor's neck beneath the orchid installation she'd spent 2 weeks designing. The clipboard in Ella's hand suddenly felt like a shield she wanted to throw. The blonde, mid-20s, dripping in diamonds Ella recognized from last month's auction preview, had her fingers curled possessively around Adrian's lapel, the same charcoal Tom Ford suit Ella had helped him pick out yesterday. The emerald engagement ring on Ella's finger caught the light like a lie she'd been wearing for too long. "You absolute coward." Her voice came out steady, colder than the ice sculptures melting slowly near the silent auction tables. Adrian jerked back, lipstick smeared across his collar like a confession written in crimson. The blonde didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. She just smiled, slow, feline, victorious. "Ella, this isn't... God, this isn't what you think," Adrian stammered, which was possibly the stupidest thing he could have said, considering his hand was still resting on the small of her back. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. A champagne cork popped somewhere behind Ella. She flinched, though she hadn't touched the bottle. The sound ricocheted through the space, and suddenly eyes were turning. Murmurs started weaving through the crowd like a storm gathering offshore. She could feel the weight of 300 guests beginning to notice, beginning to watch. "How long?" Ella's event planner voice stayed measured, controlled, even as the floor seemed to tilt beneath her Louboutins. "How long have you been sleeping with her, Adrian?" The blonde laughed, actually laughed, a bright, cruel sound that cut through the string quartet's Vivaldi. "Since the spring benefit, sweetheart. You were so busy micromanaging the seating chart, you didn't notice him micromanaging me in the coat check." The words hit like a fist to the sternum. 3 months. They'd been planning a summer engagement party for 3 months while he'd been unraveling everything between the canapes and the donors' speeches. The gala's music swelled around them, violins soaring into something romantic and oblivious, while Ella's carefully constructed life collapsed between the champagne tower and the botanical centerpieces that cost more than her monthly rent. Adrian reached for her, an instinct. Maybe, or a performance, and Ella stepped backwards so fast she collided with something solid, with someone. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her instantly, and she registered the scent before anything else. Cedar and tobacco and something darker, expensive leather, old-world cologne, the kind of scent you didn't buy off a department store shelf. "Careful!" The voice rolled over her like distant thunder, low, controlled, edged with something that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Those shoes look expensive. Would be ashamed to break an ankle running from garbage." Ella turned and found herself staring at a chest wrapped in white linen, so pristine it seemed to glow under the chandeliers. She tilted her head back and kept tilting, until she met eyes so dark they looked black in the golden light. The man was a study in contradictions. Sharp cheekbones that could have been carved by a master sculptor, a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled, and a white Panama hat that should have looked ridiculous, but instead made him look like he'd stepped out of a 1940s film noir. A thin scar traced along his jawline, barely visible, old but deliberate. The kind you didn't get from an accident. He was looking at Adrian and the blonde with the sort of detached disdain someone might reserve for something rotting on the sidewalk. Around them, the crowd had gone unnaturally still. People were stepping back, subtly, instinctively, creating a perimeter of space like this stranger carried his own gravitational field, or his own danger. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Adrian demanded, puffing his chest in a pathetic attempt at authority. His voice cracked halfway through. Someone who knows the difference between a man of value and a man of excuses. The stranger's hand was still on Ella's shoulder, warm, grounding, possessive in a way that didn't feel invasive. His accent was faint, European, unplaceable. This event is hosted by people I do business with. I don't tolerate mediocre men making scenes at elegant gatherings. There was something in the way he said business, something that made Adrian go pale beneath his tan. Ella noticed it then. Men in dark suits positioned near the exits, not security guards from her hired team. These were different, watchful, still. The kind of men who didn't need to advertise their danger because everyone already knew. Callimaco Cauchy, someone whispered from the crowd, and the name moved through the room like a shockwave. Ella's breath caught. She knew that name. Everyone in her world knew that name, or at least the rumors. The mysterious European benefactor who'd bought half of Soho's galleries in cash. The man whose art deals were worth millions, but whose name appeared in no business registries. The one the feds whispered about, but could never touch. And she'd just backed into him like a clumsy drunk at a college party. The champagne she'd been stress-sipping all night was making everything feel too bright, too close. Or maybe it was shock, or rage, or heartbreak. But suddenly, recklessly, Ella had the worst, most brilliant idea of her entire life. She turned in Callimaco's grip, looking up at this stranger with his scarred jaw and his predator's stillness. "I need a favor." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, though she swayed just slightly on her heels. "Can you kiss me? I want to make him jealous." The entire ballroom seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Callimaco Cauchy's expression didn't change. Not exactly, but one dark eyebrow lifted a fraction of an inch. It was the only sign of surprise on a face that looked like it had been trained never to reveal anything. Up close, Ella could see flecks of amber buried in those dark eyes, could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his mouth tightened, just barely, as he studied her face like she was a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter tonight. "You've been drinking," he observed. Not a question, not quite a judgment either. "I've been destroyed," Ella corrected, her words slightly slurred from 2 glasses of Moët and the bourbon she'd stolen from the bar when the donors weren't looking. "But yes, also drinking, please. I just caught my boyfriend with someone half my age at an event I planned, and I refuse to be the pathetic one in front of 300 witnesses." She could feel Adrian staring, could feel the blonde's smug smile from across the space. The entire gala had stopped pretending not to watch. They were the nucleus of a scandal that would fuel society gossip for months. Callimaco's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, from her shoulder to cup her jaw. His thumb brushed her cheekbone with surprising gentleness, and Ella's breath hitched despite everything. His hands weren't soft. There were calluses along his palm. This was a man who did more than sign checks and attend galas. "Do you have any idea who I am?" His voice dropped low enough that only she could hear it. Intimate as a secret, dark as a threat. "A man who knows the difference between value and excuses," Ella quoted back at him, "reckless with heartbreak and veuve Clicquot. And apparently someone everyone in this room is terrified of, which makes you perfect for making my cheating bastard of an ex-boyfriend lose his mind." Something shifted in those dark eyes. Amusement, maybe. Or interest. His thumb traced the curve of her lower lip, and Ella felt heat flood through her despite the air conditioning, despite the crowd, despite every logical reason this was a terrible idea. Up close, he smelled like smoke and leather and something faintly metallic. Gunpowder, maybe, or old money and older sins. "This is a terrible idea," Callimaco murmured, his gaze dropping to her mouth, but he was already lowering his head, brim of his hat shadowing them both. "All my best ideas are terrible," Ella whispered back. When his mouth touched hers, the entire world caught fire. The kiss started as a performance. Ella was almost certain of that. Callimaco Cauchy was simply doing a desperate woman a favor, giving her one brief, burning moment of dignity in front of the man who'd humiliated her. But then his hand slid into her hair, and her fingers curled into the lapels of his white suit jacket, and the kiss deepened, slow, deliberate, devastating, like he was making a point to everyone watching, or maybe just to her. Flashbulbs exploded around them. Gasps rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Somewhere in the chaos, Ella heard Adrian say her name, wounded, shocked, furious. She didn't care. For the first time all night, she didn't care about anything except the taste of whiskey and danger on a stranger's lips, and the way the most feared man in New York was holding her like she was something precious he'd decided to steal. When they finally broke apart, Callimaco's expression was unreadable again, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. "Now," he said quietly, his accent wrapping around the word like silk over a blade, "you've made a scene. And you've made a choice." Ella's heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear the music anymore. What kind of choice? His thumb brushed her jaw one last time before he stepped back, adjusting the brim of his hat with the kind of ease that came from a lifetime of commanding rooms. "The kind," Callimaco said, his gaze flicking briefly to Adrian, who stood frozen, pale, humiliated, before returning to her. "That comes with consequences." Ella woke to the sound of her phone vibrating itself off her nightstand. It hit the floor with a crack that made her wince, but the screen kept lighting up, notification after notification cascading down like an avalanche she couldn't stop. She grabbed it with shaking hands, squinting against the morning light bleeding through her curtains. The first headline made her stomach drop. "The Emerald Mistress, Mystery Mogul, Kisses Event Planner in Public Betrayal. Drama." The photo beneath it was devastating in its clarity. Callimaco Cauchi's hand cradling her face, her fingers twisted in his white jacket, the kiss frozen in perfect, scandalous detail. The emerald dress caught the light like a spotlight. Her expression looked almost desperate. His looked like conquest. "Oh God," Ella whispered. She scrolled. Every gossip site, every society page, every tabloid from the Post to the Times style section had picked it up. "Who is the woman who tamed Manhattan's most dangerous bachelor?" one asked. "Adrian Lauren's fiancé, caught in explosive love triangle," claimed another. Her phone buzzed again, a call this time. Adrian's name flashed across the screen. She declined it, immediately a text. "Ella, we need to talk. This is insane. Call me back now." Then another from her boss, Patricia. "Office, 9 a.m., not optional." Then her mother. "Evelyn Marie Savoy, what on earth is this photo?" Ella dropped the phone like it had burned her. By the time she arrived at the office an hour later, still wearing yesterday's makeup and a hastily thrown-on blazer, Patricia was waiting with her arms crossed and a printout of the photo on her desk. "Suspended," Patricia said flatly before Ella could even sit down. 2 weeks, unpaid, until this circus dies down." "Patricia, you didn't what? Make out with a criminal at a charity gala you were running?" Patricia's voice was ice. "Half our donors are pulling out. The Mirabelle is threatening to blacklist us. Do you have any idea who that man is?" Ella's throat tightened. "I'm starting to." "Then you should start praying he loses interest before you lose more than your reputation." By evening, Ella was pacing her apartment in sweatpants and desperation, scrolling through job listings she couldn't focus on when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "There's a car waiting downstairs. Dinner. We need to talk." No signature, no explanation, but somehow she knew exactly who it was. Ella looked down at her ratty NYU hoodie, then at the message, then at the window. 5 floors below, a black Mercedes idled at the curb, sleek and predatory as a panther. She should ignore it, delete the message, lock her door and pretend the last 24 hours had been a fever dream. Instead, she changed into a black slip dress and heels, swiped on lipstick like war paint, and went downstairs. The driver didn't speak. Didn't even look at her, just opened the door to reveal Callimaco Cauchi sitting in the back seat, still dressed like he'd stepped out of a cologne ad, this time in charcoal gray, hat resting on his knee, eyes unreadable in the dim light. "Get in," he said. Not a question. Ella slid into the seat, and the door closed behind her with a soft, final click. "You've got some nerve," she started, but Calamaco raised one hand, just slightly, and she fell silent. "We need to fix what you broke," he said calmly, as the car pulled smoothly into traffic. "What I broke?" Ella's voice climbed. "You're the one who... You asked me to kiss you," Calamaco interrupted, his gaze sliding to hers. "I obliged. Now the world thinks you're mine. That complicates things." "I'm not yours." "No," he agreed, something dark flickering in his expression. "But they don't know that." The restaurant had no sign, just a burgundy door on a street Ella didn't recognize, flanked by two men in suits who looked like they could break bones as easily as they opened doors. Inside, it was all exposed brick and candlelight, tables spaced far enough apart that conversation stayed private. Every other table had at least one man who didn't look like he belonged in polite society. Expensive watches, cold eyes, the kind of tension that came from carrying weapons under tailored jackets. Calamaco led her to a corner booth. A waiter appeared instantly with wine she didn't order. "Why did you kiss me?" Ella demanded once they were alone, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Really?" Calamaco leaned back, studying her like she was a painting he was considering buying. "You asked," he said simply. "And I don't refuse bold women." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting tonight." Ella's pulse hammered. "So what now? You brought me here to tell me to keep my mouth shut? Threaten me into silence?" "No." Calamaco's voice dropped. Quiet and certain. "I brought you here to warn you." He leaned forward, and the candlelight carved shadows across his scarred jaw. "You've been seen with me, Miss Savoy. That comes with consequences. People will assume things. Dangerous people. You're no longer invisible." "I never asked to be visible," Ella shot back. "No," Calamaco agreed, his eyes locked on hers. "But you are now. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Ella opened her mouth to respond, and her phone, sitting on the table between them, lit up with a photo notification. A picture of her apartment door, taken from inside her hallway, tonight. Her blood turned to ice. Calamaco glanced at the screen, his expression hardening into something lethal. "That," he said quietly, "is what I meant by consequences." The photo on Ella's phone stared back at her like a threat written in pixels. Her apartment door, photographed from inside her own hallway, time-stamped 20 minutes ago, while she'd been sitting here with Calamaco. "I need to go home," Ella said, her voice cracking as she grabbed her purse. "You need to stay exactly where you are." Calamaco's hand covered hers on the table, firm, grounding. "My men are already there." "Your men?" Ella's breath came too fast. "What the hell is happening?" "Consequences," Calamaco said quietly, already typing something on his phone with his free hand. "I warned you." By the time they arrived at her apartment building, police lights were painting the street in red and blue. Ella's stomach turned to lead as Calamaco escorted her upstairs, his hand never leaving the small of her back, two of his security flanking them like shadows. Her door hung open, splintered where the lock had been forced. Inside was devastation, not robbery, destruction. Every photograph she owned had been torn from frames and shredded across her living room floor like confetti. Her couch cushions were slashed open, stuffing spilling out like guts. And there, in the center of her bedroom floor, lay the emerald dress from the gala, cut into ribbons, the satin shimmering uselessly in the overhead light. Ella's knees went weak. Calamaco caught her elbow, steadying her, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. "Don't touch anything," he said, his voice deadly calm. "The police will want photos." "Why?" Ella whispered, staring at the ruins of her life. "Why would someone do this?" "Because they think you matter to me," Callimaco turned her to face him, his dark eyes burning. And in my world, anything that matters becomes a target. I don't matter to you. We kissed once. They don't know that. His thumb brushed her wrist, the touch absurdly gentle against the chaos around them. And now neither do I. The police took statements, filed reports, told her to be careful and call if anything else happens, like she was dealing with a jilted ex instead of professional criminals who knew how to pick locks and send messages written in shredded photographs. Callimaco waited until they left, then poured her a glass of water she couldn't drink. "Pack a bag," he said. "You're coming with me." "Excuse me?" "I have a secured penthouse in Tribeca, 3 floors, bulletproof windows, security that actually works. You'll stay there until this blows over." Ella laughed, a sharp, borderline hysterical sound. "I'm not moving in with you. I don't even know you." "You know enough." Callimaco's expression didn't change. "And you're smart enough to recognize when you're out of your depth. I'll get a hotel. Hotels have lobbies, elevators, 100 ways in." He stepped closer, and Ella's back hit the wall. "You want to test how serious my enemies are? Keep sleeping here. See what message they send next." Ella's pulse hammered. "This is insane." "Yes," Callimaco agreed. "It is. But you kissed me in front of 300 witnesses, and now we both have to live with that." "I didn't ask for this." "No." Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or something darker. "But here we are." She lasted 2 days in a hotel before her car tires were slashed. One more day before an envelope appeared under her door. Surveillance photos of her at the grocery store, the gym, the coffee shop on her corner, each one marked with a red X over her face. When Callimaco's car pulled up that evening, Ella was already waiting on the curb with her suitcase. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just opened the door. The penthouse was ridiculous, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson, furniture that looked like it cost more than her yearly salary, and silence so complete it felt like being suspended in glass. Callimaco showed her to the guest room without ceremony, then disappeared into his office, leaving Ella alone with her racing thoughts and a panic she couldn't quite swallow. Hours later, she found him on the terrace, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, the city glittering below like scattered diamonds. "Can't sleep?" he asked without turning. "Can you?" Ella countered, wrapping her arms around herself against the night air. Callimaco glanced at her, then poured a second glass and held it out. "Rarely." She took it. The whiskey burned, smooth and expensive, nothing like the cheap bourbon she usually drank. "Why are you doing this?" Ella asked. "Really, you don't owe me anything." Callimaco was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "My family owned a vineyard once," he said finally, "in Sicily, before I was born, before everything went to hell." He swirled the whiskey slowly. "Rivals burned it, took the land, destroyed everything my grandfather built." Ella stayed silent, sensing this was a story he didn't tell often. "I built an empire out of what they destroyed." His voice was low, edged with something raw. "But empires aren't the same as legacy. They're not pure." He looked at her then, and for the first time, Ella saw past the crime lord, the feared name, the man who controlled rooms with silence. She saw someone who'd lost something he couldn't buy back. "You remind me," Callimaco said quietly, "that some things are still worth protecting." Ella's breath caught. "I'm not your redemption, Callimaco." "No," he agreed, his eyes holding hers. "But maybe you're the reason I started looking for it." The city hummed below them, oblivious and endless. And for the first time since the kiss that shattered her world, Ella wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd collided with the one man dangerous enough to put it back together, even if it destroyed them both. 3 weeks in the penthouse felt like living inside a gilded cage with a panther who kept forgetting she wasn't prey. Ella had expected confinement. What she got instead was collaboration. "These gallery contracts are a disaster," she'd told Callimaco one morning. flipping through paperwork he'd left on the kitchen counter. Your legitimate businesses look like they're trying to seem suspicious. He'd looked up from his espresso, one eyebrow raised. You're critiquing my empire now? I'm critiquing your branding. Ella tapped the files with one finger. If you want people to believe you're clean, stop making your art acquisitions look like money laundering. Something shifted in his expression, amusement maybe, or respect. Fix it then, he'd said. So she did. The days took on a rhythm that felt dangerous in its domesticity. Mornings reviewing acquisition proposals over coffee, afternoons redesigning his gallery's public image. Evenings when Callimaco's business associates arrived, and Ella retreated to her room, pretending she couldn't hear the low, tense conversations in Italian that drifted through the walls. But it was the nights that undid her. The nights when she'd find him on the terrace again, smoking thin cigars, and watching the city like a king surveying a kingdom he'd conquered but couldn't quite trust. When he'd pour her whiskey without asking, and they'd talk about everything except the kiss that had rewritten both their lives. He told her about Sicily in fragments, the vineyard his grandfather planted, the rival family that burned it, the years he'd spent building power from ash and anger. She told him about the galas she'd orchestrated, the invisible architecture of elegance she'd perfected, the way Adrian had made her feel like she was always one mistake away from being too much or not enough. He was a fool, Callimaco said one night, his voice quiet and certain. Ella's breath caught. You don't know me well enough to say that. I know enough. His dark eyes found hers across the terrace. You built yourself into someone irreplaceable, and he replaced you anyway. That's not your failure. It's his. For the first time in months, Ella felt the knot in her chest loosen. Felt seen. The night everything changed started with an argument. Ella had been reworking the marketing strategy for Callimaco's Soho gallery when he'd walked in and dismissed her entire plan with 4 words. That won't work. Try again. Excuse me? Ella looked up from her laptop, irritation flaring hot. The rebrand is too soft. It makes us look apologetic. Callimaco loosened his tie, charcoal silk against white linen, and poured himself scotch. We're not apologizing. We're establishing dominance. We're establishing legitimacy, Ella shot back, standing. There's a difference between confidence and arrogance. And you're an expert on my world now? I'm an expert on making people believe a narrative, her voice climbed. But you keep overruling every decision I make like I'm some assistant who doesn't know what she's doing. Callimaco set down his glass with deliberate care. You're upset. I'm frustrated. Ella's hands curled into fists. You brought me here. You put me to work. But the second I push back, you shut me down. You can't decide everything for me, Callimaco. I'm not one of your soldiers. The silence that followed felt like static before lightning. Callimaco crossed the room slowly, each step measured, until he stood close enough that Ella had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. You asked me to kiss you once, he said, his voice dropping to something low and dark and devastating. You haven't stopped asking since, Ella's breath stuttered. I haven't, not with words. His hand came up, thumb tracing her jawline with maddening gentleness. With every look, every argument, every night you find me on that terrace like you're daring me to finish what we started. Her pulse hammered so hard she could barely think. You're imagining things. Am I? The challenge hung between them, electric and inevitable. Ella's fingers curled into the front of his shirt, silk and sandalwood and the smell of smoke, and pulled him down. The kiss wasn't careful this time. It was hunger and 3 weeks of proximity and the crack of every wall they'd both built to keep this from happening. Callimaco's hands slid into her hair, angling her head back as he deepened the kiss, and Ella made a sound she'd be embarrassed about later. Needy, desperate, real. He walked her backward until her spine hit the wall, his body pressing against hers. All controlled power and restrained violence turning into something molten. Tell me to stop, Callimaco murmured against her mouth, his accent thicker now, frayed at the edges. Ella's answer was to kiss him harder. She woke in his bed as dawn painted the windows gold and gray. Calamaco was already awake, propped on one elbow, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Possessive, maybe, or something closer to wonder. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. Ella should have said yes, should have pulled the sheet around herself and retreated to the safety of her own room, her own life, the version of herself that didn't sleep with crime lords, who kept loaded guns in their nightstand. Instead, she reached up and traced the scar along his jaw. "Ask me tomorrow," she whispered, because the truth was more complicated than regret. She'd fallen for a man whose name made federal agents nervous, and whose enemies sent threats written in shredded photographs. A man who'd built an empire on blood and ambition, but still dreamed about Sicilian vineyards and second chances. It was reckless, dangerous, possibly the worst decision she'd ever made. But when Calamaco looked at her like she was the only thing in his world worth protecting, for the first time in years, Ella Savoy felt like she was exactly where she belonged, even if it destroyed them both. The first 3 days after they crossed that line felt like living in a fever dream. Stolen hours between Calamaco's meetings, mornings tangled in sheets that cost more than Ella's former rent, nights where he'd trace the curve of her spine and tell her stories about Sicily in a voice gone soft with memory. She should have known it couldn't last. Adrian appeared on a Thursday. Ella was leaving a coffee shop 2 blocks from the penthouse, her first solo venture outside in days, when she nearly collided with him on the sidewalk. "Ella, Jesus, finally!" He looked terrible, unshaven, rumpled suit, eyes bloodshot with something between desperation and fear. "I've been calling for weeks. Please, 5 minutes." Her first instinct was to walk away, but something in his expression stopped her. Genuine panic, the kind she'd never seen on Adrian's carefully curated face. 2 minutes, she said coldly. Talk. They moved to a bench near a dog park. Adrian's hands shook as he raked them through his hair. "The FBI came to the gallery," he said, voice low and urgent. 3 agents. They're asking questions about Calamaco Cocci, about his business interests, about you. He looked at her with something close to pity. "Ella, do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into? That's not your concern anymore. They think you're helping him launder money through art deals." Adrian grabbed her hand. She yanked it back. "They showed me photos. You going into his buildings, meeting with his associates. They're building a case, and you're going to get caught in it." Ella's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Why do you care?" "Because despite everything, I don't want to see you in handcuffs." His eyes searched hers. "Come back. We can fix this. I made a mistake with Claire, but you're making a catastrophic one with him." "I'm not coming back, Adrian." Ella stood, slinging her purse over her shoulder. "We're done." "Stay away from me." She walked away before he could respond, her pulse hammering, his words echoing in her head. They're building a case. That night, Ella couldn't sleep. She was pouring herself water in the kitchen near midnight when she heard voices drifting from Calamaco's study, the door slightly ajar, light spilling into the hallway, and Adrian's voice. Complete records, shipment logs, buyer names, everything from the past 2 years. But I need protection. Witness relocation. Ella's blood turned to ice. A second voice, unfamiliar. "You deliver what you promised, Mr. Lorne, and we'll take care of you. When's your next meeting with Cocci's people?" "Tomorrow night. The warehouse in Red Hook. I told them I had investors interested in the Baroque collection." Ella's hand clenched around the glass. "Perfect. We'll have teams in position." She moved before she could think, slipping back down the hallway, grabbing her phone, fingers shaking as she texted Calamaco. "Don't go to Red Hook tomorrow. It's a trap. Adrian's working with the feds." The response came in seconds. "Where are you?" "Penthouse. He's in your study right now. Stay in your room. Lock the door." The commotion came 20 minutes later, raised voices, a scuffle, then silence so profound it felt like the building was holding its breath. Ella waited, heart hammering, until her door opened. Callimaco stood in the doorway, his white shirt rolled to his elbows, jaw tight with barely restrained fury. "He's gone," he said quietly. "My men are handling it." Ella didn't ask what that meant, wasn't sure she wanted to know. "They're watching me now," she whispered. "The FBI. Adrian said they have photos, that they think I'm part of your—" She couldn't finish. Callimaco crossed the room, cupping her face with hands that were gentle despite the violence still simmering in his eyes. "You saved my life tonight," he said, his accent thicker with emotion. "Do you understand that?" "I need to know the truth." Ella's voice broke. "All of it. What am I protecting you from, Callimaco?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped back, moved to the window, the city glittering below like scattered evidence. "I told you my family lost everything," he began, each word carefully measured. "What I didn't tell you is how I got it back, the deals I made, the lines I crossed." He turned to face her, and for the first time, he looked almost vulnerable. "You can't build an empire clean in a dirty city, Ella. I tried. God knows I tried, but the world I came from doesn't let you leave without paying the toll." "Are you laundering money?" Ella asked, needing to hear it. "I was." His eyes held hers. "I'm trying to go legitimate. The galleries, the vineyard project, it's real. But washing away the past takes time and enemies." Ella should have run, should have called a lawyer, packed her things, disappeared before the inevitable raid came. But when she looked at Callimaco, this man who'd protected her, seen her, made her feel like she was worth burning the world for, she couldn't. "I'm not naive," she said quietly, "and I'm not helpless. But if I stay, if we do this, I need to know you're really trying to get out." Callimaco closed the distance between them, pressing his forehead to hers. "I'm trying," he whispered. "For the first time in my life, I'm trying to be the man who deserves you." It wasn't an absolution, but it was enough. For now. The first 3 days after they crossed that line felt like living in a fever dream. Stolen hours between Callimaco's meetings, mornings tangled in sheets that cost more than Ella's former rent, nights where he'd trace the curve of her spine and tell her stories about Sicily in a voice gone soft with memory. She should have known it couldn't last. The raid came at dawn on a Thursday. Ella woke to the sound of shattering glass and shouting, not in the penthouse, but filtering up from the street below. She bolted upright, reaching for Callimaco, but his side of the bed was already cold. He stood at the window, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and lethal in Italian. Even from across the room, Ella could see the tension carved into his shoulders, the way his free hand had curled into a fist. "Callimaco?" Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. He turned, and something in his expression made her chest tighten with dread. "Get dressed," he said quietly. "They're hitting the Red Hook warehouse." "Who?" "FBI." He was already moving, pulling on clothes with practiced efficiency. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "I'm not hiding while—" The rest of her sentence died as his phone lit up with a video feed. Armed agents in tactical gear swarming a warehouse she recognized from paperwork she'd reviewed last week. Gunfire cracked through the speakers. Sharp, brutal, real. Ella's blood turned to ice. "Stay here," Callimaco repeated, his eyes holding hers for one burning second before he was gone, the door slamming behind him with terrible finality. The FBI came for her 90 minutes later, not with guns, but with badges and polite, immovable authority that felt just as dangerous. Special Agent Reeves was tall, graying, with eyes that had seen too much and believed too little. "Ella Savoy?" He held up his credentials like a verdict. "We need you to come with us." "Am I under arrest?" "That depends on how cooperative you are." They took her to a federal building downtown, fluorescent lights and windowless rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and broken lives. Ella sat across from Reeves and his partner, a woman named Chen, who watched her like a hawk studying prey. "How long have you been working for Kalamako, Koshi?" Reeves slid a photo across the table. Ella at the gala, mid-kiss, Kalamako's hand cradling her face. "I don't work for him." "No?" Chen leaned forward. "Then explain these." More photos. Ella entering the penthouse, meeting with gallery owners, reviewing contracts at restaurants where Kalamako's associates gathered. Each one stamped with dates, times, locations, a map of her last month turned into evidence. "I was consulting on his art business," Ella said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. "Legitimate business." "There's nothing legitimate about laundering $40 million through gallery acquisitions." Reeves opened a folder, spreading bank records across the table like accusations. Wire transfers, shell companies, offshore accounts traced back to Kashi's network. Ella stared at the numbers, the names, the vast spiderweb of transactions she'd never seen, never imagined. "You knew," Chen said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't." Ella's hands shook. "I was helping rebrand the galleries, marketing, public image. I never saw—" "You lived with him for 3 weeks." Reeves's voice cut like a blade. "Shared his bed, had access to his files. You expect us to believe you're just a naive girlfriend who didn't ask questions?" Girlfriend. The word felt wrong and right and devastating all at once. "I want a lawyer," Ella whispered. She didn't see Kalamako until they brought him in hours later. He looked like violence contained, split lip, bruised knuckles, his white shirt torn and blood-stained. But his eyes found hers across the corridor with laser focus, and for one heartbeat, the chaos of the federal building fell away. Then they were pushing him into another room, and Ella was being led back to interrogation. "Mr. Kashi is making a deal," Reeves said, sitting down across from her again. "Full confession to money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy, in exchange for reduced sentencing and immunity for certain parties." Ella's breath stopped. "Certain parties?" Chen slid a paper across the table. "You're being released, Miss Savoy. No charges. You're free to go." "I don't understand." "He took full responsibility." Reeves's expression was unreadable. "Says you had no knowledge of his criminal operations, that you were an unwitting participant, a victim, essentially." Victim. The word tasted like ash. They let her see him once before transport. A windowless room, 2 guards at the door, 30 seconds that felt like drowning. Kalamako stood when she entered, and despite everything, the charges, the evidence, the empire collapsing around him, he looked at her like she was still the only thing in the room that mattered. "You shouldn't have done that," Ella said, her voice breaking. You could have gone to prison." His hand came up, cupping her face the way he had at the gala, the way he had 100 times since. "I won't let that happen." "How long?" 2 years, maybe less with good behavior. He smiled, bitter and beautiful. "I've survived worse." Ella's vision blurred. "I should have walked away that night. Should have never asked you to." "Don't." Kalamako's thumb brushed her cheekbone, catching a tear. "Don't regret the only honest thing either of us has done in years." The guard cleared his throat. "Time." Kalamako leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers, like he'd done a dozen times in the quiet of the penthouse. Then he kissed her, slow, deliberate, devastating, while flashbulbs popped beyond the window and agents pretended not to watch. When he pulled back, his voice was barely a whisper. "This isn't goodbye, Emerald Girl. Just a pause." Then they were pulling him away, and Ella stood frozen in that terrible room, tasting whiskey and regret and the ghost of a promise she didn't know if she could believe. The headlines were merciless. Mafia boss, sentence. The fall of Callimaco Cocci, the Emerald Mistress, event planner, walks free, while lover takes the fall. By the end of the week, Ella's face was everywhere. The mafia boss's muse, they called her. Photographers camped outside her apartment. Former clients canceled contracts. Her mother stopped returning her calls, so Ella did the only thing she could. She disappeared. No forwarding address, no social media, no trace of the woman who'd kissed a criminal and lived to tell the tale. She vanished into the space between scandal and survival, carrying nothing but the memory of a man in a white suit who'd promised her this wasn't the end. Just a pause. And somewhere in the ruins of everything they'd built and lost, Ella chose to believe him. 2 years could remake a person if they were desperate enough. Ella Savoy learned that in the hills of Sicily, where she'd fled with nothing but a wire transfer she'd found in her account, 7 figures and a note in Callimaco's precise handwriting. For the vineyard. Build something pure. The Cocci family land had been abandoned for decades, the villa crumbling into the earth like a forgotten promise, but Ella saw what it could be, what it should be. She'd spent 6 months just clearing the fields, another year replanting vines with cuttings from heritage stock she'd hunted down across Italy. Locals thought she was insane, a disgraced American woman trying to resurrect a dead legacy that wasn't even hers. But Ella had learned something living in Callimaco's world. Power wasn't about permission. It was about vision and the will to see it through. The vineyard's first vintage sold out in 3 weeks. The second earned a feature in Wine Spectator. By the third, sommeliers were calling it a resurrection of Sicilian winemaking and the most exciting new label in a generation. Ella Savoy, no longer the Emerald Mistress, no longer Adrian's discarded girlfriend, had built an empire from ash and memory. She'd made herself untouchable. The Harvest Gala was her idea. 200 guests gathered under string lights woven through ancient olive trees, servers circulating with glasses of the 2024 Reserve, the vintage she was most proud of, complex and bold and utterly uncompromising. Ella moved through the crowd in a dress the color of Sicilian sunset, burnt orange silk that caught the firelight, greeting distributors and critics and minor Italian nobility who'd driven up from Palermo just to taste what she'd created. She was laughing at something the French ambassador said when the crowd went quiet. Not all at once, but like a ripple spreading outward from the villa's entrance, conversations dying mid-sentence, heads turning, the kind of charged silence that preceded either disaster or something inevitable. Ella turned, and there he was. Callimaco Cocci stood in the arched doorway like he'd been summoned from her memory, white linen suit, no tie, the Panama hat she remembered from a gala that felt like a lifetime ago. He looked leaner than she remembered, harder somehow, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of time served and prices paid. But his eyes, those dark, impossible eyes, found hers across the crowd with the same laser focus that had burned through her defenses 2 years ago. The world narrowed to the space between them. He walked toward her slowly, deliberately, and the crowd parted like he was Moses and they were the Red Sea. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched as the most dangerous man in New York crossed a Sicilian vineyard to reach the woman who disappeared the day he went to prison. Ella's heart hammered so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Callimaco stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell cedar and smoke, and something that was just him. The scent that had haunted her dreams for 24 months. "You built it," he said quietly, his voice rougher than she remembered, accent thicker. "Just like I knew you would." "You're early." Ella's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I thought you had 6 more months." "Good behavior." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. "And excellent lawyers." She should say something. Demand explanations. Ask why he was here, what he wanted, whether he expected to walk back into her life like no time had passed. Instead, she closed the distance between them and kissed him. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like scandal and fascination and the beginning of a story they'd tell for years. But Ella didn't care. Callimaco's arms came around her waist, lifting her slightly off her feet as he deepened the kiss, and it felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff and starting a war all at once. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing hard, the world slowly filtering back in. "You said you wanted to make him jealous," Callimaco murmured, loud enough for the nearest guest to hear, that dangerous smile finally breaking free. "You did. Every man here envies me." Ella laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded and free. "I didn't build this for jealousy," she whispered back. "I built it for us." His eyes searched hers, and she saw something crack in that carefully controlled expression. Wonder, maybe, or relief, or the kind of hope that dangerous men weren't supposed to feel. "Then show me," Callimaco said, his hand finding hers, fingers intertwining like they'd never been apart. "Show me what you built from what we destroyed." Around them, the gala slowly came back to life, whispers and raised glasses, and the beginning of gossip that would spread from Sicily to Manhattan by morning. But Ella just led him through the vineyard she'd brought back from the dead, toward the villa glowing golden in the twilight, toward the future she'd spent 2 years building out of scandal and second chances. And for the first time since the night everything fell apart, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the wreckage, some people were worth the wait, and some love stories started with a reckless kiss and ended with an empire built for two. 5 years after the kiss that shattered her world, Ella Savoy stood on the terrace of the restored Cocchi Villa and watched 200 guests celebrate what wine critics were calling the vintage of the decade. The 2029 Reserve, 7 years of work, of patience, of transformation distilled into bottles that now commanded prices she'd once thought impossible. Callimaco appeared beside her with 2 glasses of champagne, his white suit jacket discarded somewhere inside. Shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows in the Sicilian heat. He'd traded the Panama hat for silver threading his dark hair, traded danger for legitimacy so thoroughly that even the FBI had stopped watching. "Tired of your own party?" he asked, handing her a glass. "Tired of sharing you," Ella admitted, leaning into his side. Inside the villa, someone was making a toast, the Italian agriculture minister praising the vision of Signora Savoy and the legacy of the Cocchi family, reborn through bold innovation and unwavering dedication. Callimaco's arm slipped around her waist. "They love you. They love the wine," Ella smiled. "I'm just the woman crazy enough to believe a dead vineyard could come back to life." "No." He turned her to face him, his dark eyes holding hers with the same intensity that had undone her at a gala a lifetime ago. "You're the woman who made me believe I could come back to life." Through the open doors, someone called for them to return. The speeches were building towards something. She could hear her name, Callimaco's name, the clink of glasses. "We should go back in," Ella murmured. "In a moment." Callimaco took her hand, leading her down the terrace steps and into the vineyard itself. Rows of vines heavy with next season's promise, leaves rustling in the warm night breeze. They walked in comfortable silence until the villa's lights were distant stars behind them. "I need you to know something," Callimaco said finally, stopping between the rows his grandfather had planted 70 years ago. "Everything from before, the laundering, the network, the empire built on broken laws, it's gone, truly gone. I sold everything, paid every debt, walked away clean." Ella studied his face in the moonlight. She'd heard the words before from other men, promises that evaporated like morning mist. But when she looked at Callimaco, at the man who'd spent 2 years in prison to protect her, who'd given her the means to build this place, who'd waited patiently while she transformed scandal into legacy, she didn't need words. She saw it in the way he touched the vines like they were sacred, in the calluses on his hands from working harvest alongside her, in the peace that had replaced the predatory stillness he'd worn like armor. "I believe you," she said simply. Relief flickered across his expression. "Why?" "Because I see you." Ella stepped closer, her hand over his heart. "Not the reputation, not the empire, just you." And the man I see doesn't need the darkness anymore. Callimaco caught her hand, pressed it harder against his chest where his heartbeat was steady and sure. You saved me, he said quietly. That night at the gala, when you asked me to kiss you, you saved me from becoming the monster everyone thought I was. I was just trying to make Adrian jealous. No. Callimaco's thumb brushed her wrist. You were trying to remember who you were, and you reminded me who I could be. From the villa, applause erupted. Someone had clearly finished a speech. Laughter floated across the vineyard, warm and alive. We should get back, Ella said, but neither of them moved. Callimaco reached into his pocket and pulled out a glass. Somehow he'd carried his champagne all the way into the vineyard without spilling a drop. He raised it toward the villa, toward the lights and laughter and life they'd built from wreckage. To the night you made me human, he murmured, his eyes never leaving hers. Ella raised her own glass, smiling through sudden tears. And to the kiss that ruined everything, she whispered. So it could all begin, Callimaco finished. They drank as the Sicilian moon rose higher, as distant music drifted through the vines, as somewhere in the villa a champagne cork popped, sharp and celebratory, echoing the sound that had drawn a crowd's attention on the worst and best night of Ella's life. When Callimaco kissed her this time, there was no audience, no scandal, no desperation, just two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something pure from the ruins. The vineyard stretched around them, 7 vintages of proof that sometimes the most reckless decisions led to the most extraordinary destinations, that sometimes one kiss could rewrite destiny, and that love stories born in scandal could end in redemption if you were brave enough to believe in second chances. From the villa, voices called their names. Hand in hand, Ella and Callimaco walked back toward the lights, toward their guests, toward the future they'd earned through patience and transformation, and refusing to let the worst night define the rest of their lives. Behind them, the vines whispered in the warm wind. Ahead, champagne and laughter and forever.